My name is Sabrina Maxwell, a 29-year-old archival restoration specialist in Savannah, Georgia. Right at the 40th anniversary gala of our family corporation, in front of 50 high society guests, my father did something I never expected. Winston stood under the glittering crystal chandeliers, raising a glass of expensive red wine, but the look in his eyes was as cold as if he were staring at a total stranger. Without a single word of celebration or praise, he reached out and hurled a thick stack of debt invoices directly into my face. The white papers scattered through the air like jagged insults, slashing my dignity right in the middle of the whispers that began to ripple through the grand hall of the Magnolia Estate. "Don't you ever forget your place, Sabrina." His voice was iron-cold, booming through the mansion's sound system. "You are nothing but a lowly bookkeeper, not an heir to the Maxwell legacy. Learn to serve your younger brother well, or get the hell out of here immediately." I stood frozen on the marble floor, my fingers gripping my wine glass so hard my knuckles turned white. This humiliation wasn't just a momentary outburst. It was the opening shot of a conspiracy to seize the inheritance I had been silently enduring for so long. But they have no idea that behind this submissive silence, I am holding on to a secret that could incinerate the entire empire they are so desperately trying to protect. If you enjoy stories about family drama and standing up for yourself, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell to see how I take back everything that belongs to me. Now let's get into the details of the story. The heavy scent of lilies and sterile antiseptic filled the room at St. Jude's Hospital 6 months ago, marking the beginning of my quiet descent into hell. My grandmother, Rosemary Maxwell, lay frail and pale against the white sheets, her breathing a rhythmic struggle that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of our family. She was 78, a woman whose life was dedicated to the preservation of history through her vast collection of rare manuscripts at the Magnolia Estate. While my father, Winston, paced irritably in the hallway, checking his gold watch, as if her passing were a scheduled meeting he was late for, I sat by her side, clutching her cold, trembling hand. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open with a clarity that startled me. She beckoned me closer, her voice dropping to a dry, desperate whisper that barely reached my ear. "Sabrina, listen to me carefully." She gasped, her grip tightening with a strength I didn't know she still possessed. "I have prepared an escape for you, a way to protect what we've built. But Winston and Derek, they only see the gold on the covers, not the truth inside. If they find the original documents before the lawyer appears, you will lose everything. The truth is buried where the light never reaches." Before I could ask for clarification, her hand went limp, and the steady beep of the heart monitor turned into a continuous, soul-crushing drone. Winston Maxwell didn't shed a single tear when the doctor pronounced the time of death. Instead, he marched back into the room, his eyes already scanning the bedside table for her keys. Within 48 hours of the funeral, the locks on the grand library were changed. He stood before the towering oak doors, flanked by my younger brother, Derek Maxwell, who wore a smirk of unearned victory. Derek was 26, a man who spent more time at underground poker tables than in a lecture hall, yet here he was being handed the keys to the kingdom. As of this moment, Derek is the sole curator of the Maxwell collection. My father announced, his voice booming through the hallowed halls of the estate. He looked at me with a cold, dismissive sneer. "Your obsession with these dusty papers has blinded you to the reality of business, Sabrina. You are no longer in charge here. From now on, you will report to the basement." I felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under me. "Father, you can't be serious," I protested, my voice trembling with indignation. "I have spent a decade restoring these archives. Derek doesn't even know how to handle vellum without damaging it." He didn't even blink. He handed me a rusted key to the service entrance of the lower vaults. "Then you can spend your time teaching him from below. Your job is now to sort through the unsorted scrap and waste in the archives. If I catch you in the main library without permission, I will have you removed from this property permanently." I was escorted down the narrow, damp stone stairs to the basement, a dark, suffocating space filled with crates of moldy ledgers and discarded paper scraps. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. As the heavy iron door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a prison bolt, I realized my life had changed forever. I was no longer the guardian of the family's history. I was a prisoner in the cellar of my own heritage, tasked with sorting through the literal garbage of the Maxwell empire. But as I stared at the mountains of discarded crates, my grandmother's final words echoed in my mind. The truth was buried here, where the light never reached, and I would find it one scrap of paper at a time. The relentless silence of the basement became my only companion, broken only by the scratching of rats and the rhythmic thud of Derek's footsteps on the floorboards far above. Weeks turned into a blur of dust-choked lungs and freezing fingers as I meticulously sifted through mountains of damp cardboard and rotting ledgers that my father considered garbage. One humid afternoon, while moving a heavy, water-damaged crate of 19th-century tax records, the tip of my boot caught on a loose plank of the dark oak flooring near the back corner of the vault. The wood groaned under the pressure, revealing a hollow resonance that didn't match the rest of the foundation. Driven by a sudden surge of adrenaline, I used a rusted metal file to pry the board loose, uncovering a shallow cavity lined with yellowing newspaper. Nestled inside was a small scratched tin box, its lid sealed with a strip of wax. My heart hammered against my ribs as I broke the seal, revealing a leather-bound diary and a crisp, embossed business card. The diary belonged to Rosemary, and as I flipped through the pages, her elegant cursive script painted a devastating picture of betrayal. She had meticulously documented every instance of Derek's late-night visits to the library, noting the exact titles of the rare first editions he had smuggled out to settle his mounting debts at illegal poker dens. The betrayal was staggering. My brother was systematically dismembering our family heritage, and Winston was willfully blind to it. However, it was the business card that stopped my breath. It bore the name of Quentin Miller, a high-profile estate attorney known for his unwavering ethics. I remembered the day Winston told me with a feigned sigh of grief that Mr. Miller had perished in a tragic multi-car accident on the I-95, just weeks before grandmother fell ill. My father had claimed all her legal files were lost in the wreckage, forcing us to rely on his hand-picked legal team. But as I stared at the card, I noticed a faint handwritten string of numbers on the back, a private coordinates-based address, and a secondary phone line that didn't look like an office number. Risking everything, I used a burner phone I had purchased in secret to trace the details. I spent my nights huddled in the corner of my damp cell, scouring deep web archives and legal registries that Winston hadn't thought to scrub. The truth was, a jagged pill to swallow: Quentin Miller was not dead. He had been driven into hiding, forced into early retirement by Winston's relentless legal threats and a coordinated smear campaign that had nearly destroyed his reputation. He was living under an assumed name in a small coastal town 3 hours away, holding the true keys to the Maxwell Trust. I didn't confront Winston or Derek with my discovery. I knew that in this house, knowledge was only power if it remained hidden. For the next month, while I pretended to sort through moldy paper, I was actually an operative in the shadows. I spent every spare second photographing the pages of the diary and cataloging the empty spaces on the library shelves where Derek's sales had occurred. I began a secret encrypted correspondence with Mr. Miller, sending him digital scans of the evidence I uncovered piece by piece. He responded with a chilling confirmation the will Winston had presented to the family was a sophisticated forgery, and the original was held in a secure offshore digital vault that only he could access. We spent 30 days meticulously building a legal fortress, waiting for the one moment when Winston and Derek would feel most invincible, the night of the anniversary gala. As I scrubbed the grime from my face each night, I stopped feeling like a victim. I was the architect of their impending collapse, and the basement was no longer my prison. It was my war room. The transition from the damp shadows of the basement to the blinding radiance of the Magnolia Estate's ballroom felt like stepping into a gilded cage. Standing beneath the massive crystal chandeliers surrounded by 50 elite guests from Savannah's highest circles, I maintained a mask of fragile submission. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged bourbon, but for me, it smelled like an impending storm. My father, Winston, was in the middle of a grand toast boasting about the family's legacy, while Derek stood beside him, his eyes glimmering with a predatory excitement that told me he was finally ready to spring his trap. Suddenly, Derek cleared his throat, interrupting our father's speech with a practiced expression of tragic disappointment. He held up a thick folder, ensuring the nearest guests could see the official-looking seals. "I'm sorry to ruin this beautiful evening, Father." Derek's voice rang out, dripping with fake sorrow. "But as the new curator of the Maxwell collection, I've uncovered a horrifying betrayal. While sorting through grandmother's charity accounts, I discovered that over $400,000 have been systematically siphoned off into a private offshore account. The signatures on every single wire transfer belong to Sabrina." A collective gasp rippled through the 50 onlookers. I felt their judgmental stares burning into my skin like acid. Instead of defending myself, I allowed my shoulders to slump and my eyes to well up with unshed tears. I let out a soft, broken sob, shaking my head slowly as if I were too traumatized to speak. I needed them to see me as the defenseless scapegoat they expected me to be. I needed Derek to feel so superior that he would become careless with the evidence he had painstakingly forged. Winston's face transformed from a flush of celebration to a terrifying shade of crimson. He didn't ask for my side of the story. He didn't even look at the documents Derek was waving around. He lunged toward me, the air whistling as his hand struck my cheek with a deafening crack. The force of the blow sent me reeling, my champagne glass shattering against the marble floor. "You ungrateful parasite!" Winston bellowed, his voice shaking the glass ornaments on the nearby tables. "I gave you a position of trust, and you used the memory of your own grandmother to line your pockets. You are a disgrace to the Maxwell name." Derek stepped forward, feigning a need to calm our father while actually stoking the fire. He pulled a thick stack of invoices from the folder, the very ones he had used to hide his own gambling debts by forging my name. With a sneer of absolute victory, he handed them to Winston. My father didn't hesitate. He grabbed the papers and hurled them into my face. "Get out!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the grand oak entrance. "I am disowning you tonight. You will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. If I ever see your face on this property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and embezzlement." I remained on the floor for a moment, the silence of the 50 guests heavier than the blow I had just received. With trembling hands, I began to gather the scattered invoices from the cold marble, my hair shielding the small, cold smile that was beginning to form on my lips. To everyone else, I looked like a broken woman clinging to the remnants of her shame. In reality, I was securing the final pieces of their destruction. These invoices, which Derek had so arrogantly thrown at me, contained the exact digital timestamps and ink patterns that Quentin Miller needed to prove they were manufactured only 3 days ago, months after grandmother had already passed. As I stood up, clutching the papers to my chest, I looked Winston directly in the eye, seeing the man I had once called father for the last time. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The arrogance in this room was so suffocating that they couldn't see the noose I had just tightened around their necks. I turned away from the shimmering lights and walked toward the darkness of the front gates. The weight of the forged evidence in my hands feeling lighter than air. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and now the hunters were about to become the prey. The iron gates of the Magnolia Estate groaned as they swung shut behind my sedan, a sound that felt more like a liberation than a farewell. Heavy rain began to lash against the windshield, blurring the towering oaks of Savannah into ghostly silhouettes as I pressed my foot firmly on the accelerator. On the passenger seat beside me lay a weathered leather satchel, the weight of its contents far exceeding the physical papers inside. Within that bag sat my grandmother Rosemary's personal diary, the ironclad copies of her original will, and the digital logs I had spent weeks compiling evidence of Derek's systematic theft of our family's history. For 30 days, I had lived as a shadow in my own home, but tonight, the shadow had finally stepped out into the storm. Driving through the winding back roads toward the outskirts of the city, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The sting on my cheek from my father's hand had faded into a dull throb, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Every mile I put between myself and that toxic mansion was a step toward the justice I had meticulously engineered. I reached the prearranged meeting point, a secluded, dimly lit diner on the edge of a sleepy coastal town, just as the clock struck 3 in the morning. Quentin Miller was already there, tucked away in a corner booth, with a thermos of coffee and a laptop. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. I handed over the satchel, watching as his eyes scanned the forged invoices Derek had hurled at me just hours earlier. The lawyer's grim nod confirmed what I already knew: the trap was now fully operational. While I was sheltered in that quiet diner miles away back at the estate, the sun began to creep over the horizon, signaling a morning of reckoning. At exactly 7 o'clock, Winston Maxwell marched down the hallway toward my bedroom, his footsteps heavy with a lingering, self-righteous fury. He still held the keys he intended to confiscate, ready to finalize my total exclusion from the family business. He didn't knock. He threw the door open with the force of a man who believed his word was the only law in this house. He expected to find a broken daughter weeping into her pillow, perhaps begging for a shred of his mercy. Instead, the silence that greeted him was deafening. The room was stripped bare of any personal warmth. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets cold to the touch. The vanity where I had once kept my grandmother's jewelry was empty, and the closet doors swung open to reveal nothing but bare hangers. My father's face, usually a mask of arrogant control, contorted into a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage as he realized I hadn't waited for his formal eviction. I had vacated the premises on my own terms, leaving him with a hollow victory. His gaze finally fell upon the small ivory-colored card resting precisely in the center of the dark mahogany desk. He snatched it up, his breath hitching as he read the 5 words I had written in a steady, unwavering hand. "See you at the law office." There was no signature, no apology, and no explanation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The daughter he had discarded wasn't running away in shame. She was repositioning for a counterattack. Winston stood frozen in the center of the empty room, the silence of the mansion suddenly feeling less like peace and more like the calm before a devastating landslide. He looked out the window at the rain-washed gardens, finally sensing that the lowly bookkeeper he had tried to bury was about to exhume the very secrets he thought he had laid to rest forever. The mahogany-paneled conference room at the Miller and Associates law office felt like a courtroom where the sentence had already been passed. Winston and Derek sat across from an empty chair, their faces etched with a predatory satisfaction as they adjusted their silk ties, ready to finalize the transfer of the Maxwell estate. Derek was already reaching for a heavy fountain pen, his eyes scanning the final signature lines with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. They believed they had won. They believed that by casting me out into the storm, they had silenced the only voice capable of challenging their greed. The heavy double doors swung open, but it wasn't a submissive daughter who walked through. It was Quentin Miller, flanked by 2 stern-faced officers from the Financial Crimes Division and a federal agent specializing in historical preservation. My father's face drained of color, his hand trembling as he dropped the pen. "Miller," Winston gasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You're supposed to be dead." Quentin finished the sentence with a cold, sharp smile, pulling out a chair for me as I stepped into the light behind him. "A rumor you were all too happy to propagate, Winston, but as it turns out, the truth is far more resilient than your lies." He laid a thick black-bound ledger on the table, the seal of the Rosemary Maxwell Irrevocable Trust gleaming under the recessed lighting. My client, Sabrina, has spent the last month documenting a systematic betrayal of this family's heritage. And your actions at the gala last night were the final key needed to unlock her grandmother's true intentions. Derek tried to stand his voice rising in a desperate pitch. This is a joke. Sabrina is an embezzler. We have the invoices to prove she stole from the charity funds. Quentin Miller didn't even look up as he began spreading a series of documents across the table, the very same invoices Winston had hurled into my face the night before. Actually, Derek, these invoices are your funeral shroud, the lawyer stated calmly. The forensic ink analysis conducted 3 hours ago proves these were printed and signed just 4 days ago, using a forged template of Sabrina's signature. Furthermore, the digital timestamps on the original files show they were created on your personal laptop, Derek. You didn't just frame your sister. You handed her the evidence of your own fraud. The federal agent stepped forward, placing a pair of steel handcuffs on the table. Mr. Derek Maxwell, you are under arrest for grand larceny, financial fraud, and the illegal sale of national archival treasures. We have intercepted the rare manuscripts you attempted to sell on the black market, the ones your grandmother explicitly protected under a Federal Preservation Act. Winston's arrogance collapsed into a hollow mask of terror. This can't be. Rosemary would never. Rosemary predicted all of this, Winston. I interrupted, my voice steady and devoid of the pain he had tried to inflict on me. She knew that if she left the estate directly to you, Derek would gamble it away within a year. That's why the trust was designed with a failsafe. It only grants full ownership and control to me if my rights as a curator were unjustly stripped, or if I was subjected to public defamation by the other heirs. By slapping me in front of 50 people and throwing those forged papers at me, you didn't destroy me. You effectively signed over every single cent and every single book to my name. Derek's bravado vanished as the officers hauled him from his chair, his cries for help echoing uselessly against the soundproof walls. Winston sat slumped in his seat, a broken man staring at the daughter he had tried to bury. He reached out a shaking hand, perhaps to beg, perhaps to apologize, but I stepped back. The law was no longer just a set of rules on a page. It was the voice of my grandmother reaching out from the grave to ensure that her legacy and my future would never again be held hostage by their greed. The echo of the gavel falling in the local courthouse was a sound I chose not to witness in person, yet its resonance changed the landscape of Savannah forever. Derek Maxwell was eventually sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary, his charms failing to sway a judge who saw only the cold numbers of his financial fraud and the irreversible damage he had done to historical artifacts. For the first time in his life, my brother could not gamble his way out of a debt. He was finally paying a price that money could not cover. While Derek traded his designer suits for a prison uniform, the empire Winston Maxwell had spent 40 years building began to crumble like wet sand. News of the scandal spread through the high society circles of Georgia faster than a summer storm. The elite families who had toasted his success at the gala now treated his name like a contagion. Memberships were revoked, investment partners pulled out of the Maxwell Group overnight, and the once vibrant Magnolia Estate became a hollow mausoleum of debt. Winston was left with the shell of a corporation drowning in the very liabilities he had tried to pin on me, forced to watch as his legacy was dismantled by creditors and legal fees. A month after the trial, I stood in the Grand Library one last time, watching a team of professional movers carefully pack grandmother's rare vellum manuscripts into climate-controlled crates. I wasn't just cleaning out a room, I was relocating an entire heritage. Under the terms of the Rosemary Maxwell Trust, I had chosen to move the collection to a prestigious research institute in Boston. Savannah held too many ghosts, too many shadows of a family that had valued appearance over truth. As the last crate was loaded, a shadow fell across the library's threshold. Winston stood there looking 10 years older than he had just weeks ago. His hand, once so quick to strike my face, was now outstretched in a desperate, trembling plea. "Sabrina, please," he croaked, his voice stripped of its former thunder. "The bank is foreclosing on the house. Your brother, he's broken. I'm your father. You can't leave me with nothing after everything I gave you." I looked at him, searching for a shred of the fear or anger I used to feel, but I found only a quiet, resolute indifference. "You didn't give me this, father," I said, my voice as calm as the morning air. "Grandmother gave me this because she knew I was the only one who wouldn't trade her soul for a profit. You had a choice between the truth and a lie, and you chose the lie because it was convenient for your pride. I am not leaving you with nothing. I am leaving you with the consequences of your own character." I walked past him without looking back, the keys to the estate left resting on a bare pedestal where a priceless bust of a Roman philosopher once stood. I had cut the ties completely, choosing a future where my name was defined by my integrity rather than my bloodline. As my car pulled away from the moss-draped driveway of Magnolia Estate, I realized that true wealth isn't found in gold-leafed books or sprawling mansions. It is found in the courage to protect the truth when everyone else is trying to bury it. Greed and blind favoritism had been the rot in the Maxwell Foundation, but integrity had been the light that finally exposed it. I was no longer the lowly bookkeeper or the defenseless daughter. I was a woman who had stood her ground, protected a legacy, and learned that the most valuable thing one can ever own is a conscience that remains unbought. My journey was no longer about revenge. It was about the peace that comes when justice is finally served and the past is left exactly where it belongs.